On November 24, 1976, Paul Castellano stood before the Gambino family as their new boss, chosen over a man with more soldiers loyal to him. He was called the boss of bosses, ruler of America's most powerful crime family. 9 years later, that same family stood outside a Manhattan steakhouse and finished him. This is why the real Paul Castellano story is worse than Goodfellas. Section 1. The butcher's son who married into the mob. Constantino Paul Castellano was born on June 26, 1915 in Bensonhurst, a working-class section of Brooklyn filled with Italian immigrant families trying to build a life in a new country. His parents, Giuseppe and Concetta Castellano, had both come from Sicily. Concetta's maiden name was Casada. Like thousands of other Sicilian families settling in Brooklyn in the early 20th century, the Castellanos arrived with almost nothing. And built their world block by block. Through work, through family ties, and through the informal networks that ran alongside the official economy of the city. Giuseppe made his living as a butcher, running a small shop where he cut and sold meat to neighborhood families. That trade paid the bills, but it was not the only thing that kept the household running. Giuseppe also sold Italian lottery tickets on the side, a business known at the time as running numbers. Numbers was a simple, illegal lottery game that had spread through immigrant neighborhoods across New York. And after the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, when the money that had once flowed through bootlegging needed a new place to go, numbers and gambling rackets became one of the most reliable sources of income for the low-level members of organized crime families across the city. Giuseppe was one of those low-level members. He was an early figure in the Mangano crime family, the organization that would eventually grow and reshape itself into what the world later came to know as the Gambino family. He was not a boss, not an enforcer, and not a man with a public reputation. He was simply a butcher who also collected bets, paid out winners, and kept a piece of the profit moving up the chain to the men above him. Paul grew up inside that arrangement without ever having to be introduced to it. There was no moment where someone sat him down and explained what his father actually did between selling cuts of meat. It was simply the world around him, present in the same ordinary way that school, church, and the neighborhood streets were present. School did not hold his attention for long. He left in the 8th grade, still a boy by most standards, and went to work full-time beside his father. There he learned 2 trades that had almost nothing to do with each other on paper, but everything to do with each other in practice: how to butcher and sell meat, and how to collect money from the numbers racket, moving between customers, keeping track of who owed what, and understanding how a small, cash-based business actually functioned day to day. Both skills would matter enormously later in his life, though not in any way a teenager sweeping up a Brooklyn butcher shop in the 1920s could have predicted. Family ties mattered just as much as anything Paul picked up on the job, and in his case, family ties reached directly into the heart of organized crime. His sister Catherine married their cousin, a sharp and ambitious young man named Carlo Gambino, who was himself already moving up through the ranks of the same criminal world their fathers operated in. That single marriage placed Paul inside Gambino's orbit long before Paul had done anything on his own to earn that position. It is worth being precise about exactly how that family connection worked, because it gets repeated inaccurately in a lot of retellings. Later, when Paul married, his wife would technically become Carlo Gambino's sister-in-law. That fact gets stated on its own so often that it sounds like some special arrangement, when in truth it was simply the mechanical result of Paul's own sister having already married Gambino years earlier. Any woman Paul married would have carried that same technical title. It was not a separate alliance. It was one family connection producing a second label almost by accident. Still, the underlying reality mattered a great deal. In the world Paul was raised in, blood relationships and marriages built trust in a way that money alone never could. A man could earn respect through performance, But a man born or married into the right family started several steps ahead of everyone else. And Paul had that advantage working in his favor before he had proven anything about himself individually. The first real test of his own character, separate from his family name, came in July 1934. Paul, 19 years old at the time, was arrested in Hartford, Connecticut for robbing a haberdashery, a men's clothing and accessory store, alongside 2 other men. When police pressed him for the names of his accomplices, Paul refused to give them up. He served 3 months in jail rather than talk. On paper, that decision cost him nothing but a short prison sentence for a fairly minor crime. In practice, inside the world he was trying to move up in, that silence was worth far more than the months it cost him. Organized crime in New York at the time ran on an unwritten code known as omerta, a strict rule of silence that forbade cooperating with law enforcement under almost any circumstance, no matter the personal cost. A man who broke that code, even over something small, marked himself as untrustworthy for the rest of his life. A man who held to it, even under pressure, over something as ordinary as a robbery charge, proved something valuable about himself to the people watching from above. Paul's refusal to name his partners was not simply stubbornness, it was a demonstration, a small but visible proof that he could be trusted with information and would not trade it away when the pressure was on. That reputation followed him out of the Hartford jail and stayed attached to his name for the rest of his life. The organization Paul was quietly working his way into during these years had its own history of violence sitting just beneath the surface of everyday business. The Mangano family, the group his father had served, and the group Paul himself would formally join, was run at the time by Vincent Mangano, with Albert Anastasia serving as his underboss. The 2 men did not get along. Mangano and Anastasia had worked together for roughly 2 decades, but Mangano was uncomfortable with how closely Anastasia had aligned himself with other major mob figures outside the family, including Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello. And he resented the power base Anastasia had built for himself through his control of the waterfront unions and through his connection to Murder Inc., the enforcement arm that carried out contract killings on behalf of organized crime groups across the city. That tension between the 2 men never resolved peacefully. In April 1951, Vincent Mangano disappeared without a trace. His brother, Philip Mangano, was found dead around the same time. No one was ever charged in either man's death, and Vincent's body was never recovered. But it has generally been accepted that Anastasia was behind both killings. That was the environment Paul Castellano was quietly rising inside of during the 1940s. A world where a disagreement between the top 2 men in an organization could end with one of them vanishing forever and the other simply moving up to take his place. Paul's own path through that same world looked almost nothing like Anastasia's. In 1937, 3 years after his release from the Hartford jail, Paul married Nina Mano, a woman described by those who knew the family as his childhood sweetheart. The marriage tied his personal life even more tightly into the family structure that already surrounded him. Over the years that followed, Paul and Nina had 4 children together, 3 sons named Paul, Philip, and Joseph, and a daughter named Constance. Decades later, the family's reach into American culture would show up in an unexpected place. Paul's nephew, Richard S. Castellano, became a professional actor and appeared in The Godfather, playing the character of Peter Clemenza. It is a small detail, but it captures something true about how deeply organized crime and ordinary American life had become tangled together by the middle of the 20th century. Close enough that a mob boss's own nephew ended up playing a fictional version of the same world his family actually lived in. By the early 1940s, Paul had formally joined the Mangano family, the same organization his father had quietly served for years. He did not stay in a low-level role for long. Working his way up through the ranks, he became a capo, a captain responsible for running his own crew, serving under Albert Anastasia, who by then had become the dominant power inside the family, even before officially taking the top position. Anastasia's reputation rested almost entirely on violence. He had built his name through Murder, Inc., and through his willingness to solve problems with direct, immediate force. Paul was different, and the difference was not small. Where Anastasia solved problems with muscle, Paul ran his own crew more like a man running a small company. He kept close track of money. He expected the men under him to bring in steady, dependable earnings, rather than chase large, risky scores that might draw unwanted attention. Men who worked near him during these years later described his approach to the crew's finances as almost bookkeeper-like, treating every man's performance as a number to be tracked, rather than a reputation to be built through fear. Physically, Paul was not a man who blended into a room. He stood well over 6 feet tall and carried close to 270 pounds on his frame, a size that earned him the nickname Big Paulie among the men who worked around him. In an environment where physical presence carried real weight, his size made an impression before he ever opened his mouth. But size was not what set him apart from the other men climbing the same ladder inside the Mangano and later Gambino structure. It was his temperament. He preferred quiet negotiation to open conflict whenever a quiet solution was available. He thought in terms of contracts, percentages, and long-term arrangements rather than short-term intimidation. That instinct, business first and violence only when nothing else would work, would come to define nearly every major decision of his life over the next 3 decades. It would also, much later, become one of the very things that turned the men under him against him. For now, in the years following Anastasia's consolidation of power inside the family, Paul remained one part of a much larger machine. He ran his crew. He brought in steady earnings. He built a quiet, dependable reputation among the men who mattered. The kind of reputation that mob bosses valued far more than flash or bravado in the men beneath them. He was not yet a household name in organized crime circles, and he was certainly not yet the head of anything. He was a butcher's son from Bensonhurst, who had married into the right family, kept his mouth shut when it counted, and learned to run a criminal crew the same way another man might run a modest but growing business. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That would begin to change in October 1957, when a single murder inside a Manhattan barbershop tore through the top of the Mangano and Anastasia era and reshuffled the entire leadership of the family Paul had spent more than 15 years quietly climbing inside of. Section 2. Appalachian. Made men caught in a farmhouse raid. On October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia sat down in the barber's chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan for a shave. He never got up. 2 gunmen walked in, shot him repeatedly, and left him dead on the floor of the shop. No one was ever charged with the killing, but the men who ran organized crime in New York understood exactly what had happened. Anastasia, the man who had helped run the family since Vincent and Philip Mangano vanished 6 years earlier, had been removed the same way he had removed others, with sudden, coordinated violence and no witnesses willing to talk. The killing left a hole at the top of one of New York's most powerful crime families, and it left that hole at a moment when the rest of the city's underworld was already unstable. Just months earlier, in May 1957, a gunman had tried to kill Frank Castellano, the longtime boss of what was then called the Luciano family, as he walked into his own apartment building. Castellano survived, but the message was clear enough. He stepped back from running the family, and Vito Genovese, who had spent years building alliances and waiting for his moment, effectively took control. Genovese was the man widely believed to be behind both the attempt on Castellano and the killing of Anastasia, though nothing was ever proven in court. With Castellano pushed aside and Anastasia dead, Genovese suddenly found himself standing over the wreckage of two rival power structures, and he needed something the underworld valued as much as money: recognition from everyone else. That is what brought roughly 100 organized crime figures from across the United States, Canada, Italy, and Cuba to a quiet rural property in upstate New York 3 weeks later. Genovese wanted a national meeting, a formal gathering of bosses from every major family, to confirm his new position and settle a long list of outstanding business. Part of that business was deciding what would happen to Anastasia's now leaderless family. Carlo Gambino, Paul Castellano's cousin and brother-in-law, stood to inherit that family, and attending a meeting like this one gave him a chance to receive the same kind of recognition Genovese was after. The location chosen for the summit was the property of Joseph Barbera, a mob-connected beverage distributor known to associates as Joe the Barber, sitting on a large rural estate in the small town of Apalachin, New York, close to the Pennsylvania border and roughly 200 miles from New York City. The distance from the city was the entire point. A gathering that size held anywhere near New York would draw far too much attention. A farmhouse in a town most Americans had never heard of seemed safe. It was not safe. A local New York State police sergeant named Edgar Croswell had been keeping an eye on Barbara for some time, aware of his ties to organized crime figures. In the days before the meeting, Croswell picked up on unusual activity: large orders of meat and liquor being delivered to the property, and Barbara's son booking a large block of hotel rooms nearby under a vague description of a beverage industry gathering. On November 14, 1957, as expensive cars bearing license plates from states across the country began arriving at Barbara's estate, Croswell's suspicion turned into action. He ran the plates. Every one of them came back registered to men with criminal records. He called for backup, and troopers set up roadblocks along the only roads leading away from the property. What followed became one of the most retold scenes in the history of organized crime in America. When word reached the men gathered at Barbara's house that police were outside, the meeting fell apart in seconds. Some men ran for their cars and were stopped at the roadblocks. Others bolted into the surrounding woods and fields in their expensive suits, some losing their shoes in the mud as they ran. For years afterward, people in the area told stories about finding $100 bills scattered through the leaves near Barbara's property. Cash that had spilled out of the pockets of men more concerned with getting away than picking it back up. Somewhere between 58 and 63 men were caught and identified that day, depending on which record you look at, while dozens of others managed to slip away through the woods and were never accounted for. Among the men caught that day was Paul Castellano. He was 42 years old at the time, making him one of the younger men present at a gathering that included men who had been running major crime families for decades. His attendance at Apalachin says something important about where he stood inside the Gambino organization by 1957. He was no longer a low-level earner running a crew and collecting from his father's old numbers contacts. He had risen far enough and been trusted enough to sit among bosses and top advisors from crime families across the country at a meeting meant to settle the future leadership of organized crime in America. Almost every man detained that day gave police the same excuse. They claimed they had simply stopped by to check on their friend Joseph Barbera, who they said had been feeling unwell after a recent heart attack, and that the whole gathering amounted to nothing more than a casual visit or a barbecue among friends. Police did not believe a word of it, and neither did anyone else. 20 of the men detained at Apalachin were eventually charged with conspiring to obstruct justice by lying about the true nature of the meeting, and in January 1959, all 20 were found guilty, fined as much as $10,000 each, and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 3 to 5 years. Every one of those convictions was overturned on appeal the following year, a pattern that would repeat itself throughout Castellano's own legal history for decades to come. Castellano's specific path through the Apalachin case followed a slightly different route than the 20 men who were formally charged with obstruction. When called before a grand jury and asked to explain what had happened at Barbara's estate, Castellano refused to answer their questions. That refusal, consistent with the same instinct that had kept him silent after his 1934 robbery arrest in Hartford, cost him a year in prison on contempt charges. On January 13, 1960, matters got worse for him. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for conspiracy to withhold information related to the meeting. It looked, for a moment, like Apalachin might end Castellano's career before it had really begun at the national level. Then, in November 1960, an appeals court reversed his conviction entirely, and the 5-year sentence disappeared. He walked away from Apalachin with a damaged legal record but no lasting prison time, the same outcome that played out for most of the men caught that day. The consequences of Apalachin reached far beyond the individual men who were arrested and later cleared. For years, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had publicly denied that anything resembling a coordinated, nationwide criminal organization existed in the United States. Local police departments chased local gangsters, and federal law enforcement treated organized crime as scattered, regional, and disconnected. The image of roughly 60 well-dressed, well-connected men from cities across the entire country converging on one rural property at the same time for what was clearly a coordinated business meeting made that denial impossible to maintain. Within days of the raid, Hoover ordered the creation of an anti-mob initiative inside the FBI, a program that would eventually grow into a sustained, coordinated federal effort against organized crime. Something that had never existed in any serious form before Apalachin forced the issue into public view. Congressional hearings followed in the years after, examining organized crime and labor racketeering across the country, and the legal groundwork that would eventually produce the RICO Act in 1970. The law used decades later to prosecute Castellano himself traces directly back to the political pressure that built after reporters and investigators realized just how large and organized the American mafia actually was. For Castellano personally, Apalachin marked a turning point of a different kind. He had entered 1957 as a capable capo working under Anastasia, respected inside his own crew, but not yet a nationally known figure. He left the year having survived a criminal charge tied directly to one of the most significant organized crime events in American history, having stood alongside his cousin Gambino at a moment when Gambino's own path to becoming boss of the family was effectively being confirmed by the underworld's most powerful figures. Anastasia's death and Geneviese's failed attempt to cement total control both worked in Gambino's favor over the following years. Genovese himself would soon fall, convicted on narcotics charges in 1959 that many believed had been engineered by his own rivals inside the underworld as payback for the chaos Apalachin had caused. Gambino, by contrast, quietly consolidated power as boss of what was now officially known as the Gambino crime family, and Castellano, his cousin and brother-in-law, stood close enough to that rise to benefit directly from it. Over the following years, as Gambino settled into running the family, Castellano's role shifted away from street-level crew work and towards something closer to a corporate operations job inside a criminal organization. This was the period where the instincts he had shown as a young capo, tracking money carefully and preferring negotiation over violence, started to define his entire career. Castellano began building what amounted to a business empire, one designed to generate steady, reliable income while creating enough legal distance to keep him personally insulated from the riskier, more violent side of the family's operations that other capos handled. One of the clearest examples of this approach involved the construction industry in New York City, a business worth enormous sums of money every year, and one the Gambino family had worked its way deep into over the preceding decades. Castellano became a central figure in what was known inside the industry as the Concrete Club, an arrangement in which a select group of contractors, chosen with the approval of the Commission, the ruling body that oversaw disputes between New York's major crime families, were given control over every major construction contract in the city, valued between $2 million and $15 million. In exchange for that guaranteed access to lucrative work, those contractors paid a 2% kickback on the total value of every contract back to the Commission. It was, in effect, an invisible tax on a huge share of New York's building industry, collected quietly and consistently, with the threat of labor disruption or physical violence sitting in the background as the enforcement mechanism that kept contractors paying without complaint. Labor unions were the second major piece of this same strategy. Castellano supervised Gambino family control over Teamsters Union Local 282, a union responsible for supplying workers who delivered and poured concrete at nearly every major construction site across New York City and Long Island. Controlling that single union gave the family enormous leverage over the entire construction industry in the region, because a labor slowdown or a refusal to deliver materials could bring a major building project to a complete stop. Contractors who wanted to keep their projects moving on schedule had every incentive to stay on good terms with the people who controlled that union, and Castellano sat near the center of that arrangement. Beyond construction, Castellano built and expanded a legitimate-looking meat distribution business called Dial Poultry, which at its peak supplied more than 300 butcher shops across New York City. On paper, it was an ordinary wholesale food business, tracing back in a strange, almost poetic way to the butcher shop his father Giuseppe had run in Brooklyn decades earlier. In practice, businesses like Dial Poultry served two purposes at once inside the world Castellano operated in. They generated real, legal income, and they gave organized crime figures a legitimate-looking place to move illicit money through, cleaning cash earned from rackets by running it through the books of an ordinary-looking company that sold meat to grocery stores and restaurants across the city. This approach set Castellano apart from many of the men around him, and it would eventually set him apart from the entire direction the Gambino family took after Gambino's death. Where older-style mob bosses built their reputations on visible power and physical force, Castellano built his on financial control, industry access, and quiet, steady kickback arrangements that ran largely out of public view. He identified more as a businessman than as a criminal, and in many ways, his own businesses did become legitimate over time, even though they had grown directly out of and continued to benefit from ties to organized crime that never fully disappeared. By the early 1970s, this strategy had made Castellano one of the family's most important earners, a man whose value came not from muscle or fear, but from his ability to generate consistent, large-scale income while staying legally insulated from most of the violence that came with running a criminal organization. Carlo Gambino noticed. As Gambino grew older, he began relying on his cousin as a key advisor, someone he trusted with the family's financial interests in a way he did not trust in quite the same way with Agnello Della Croce, his longtime underboss, who remained far more connected to the traditional, street-level side of the family's operations. That growing trust between Gambino and Castellano, built up over nearly 2 decades since the chaos of Apalachin, would soon put Castellano in position for the single biggest decision Carlo Gambino would ever make. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That decision came in October 1976, when Carlo Gambino, the man who had shaped Castellano's entire career from the barbershop killing of Albert Anastasia onward, died quietly of a heart attack at his home, and left behind a choice about who would run his family that almost no one inside the organization expected him to make. Section 3. Taking the throne and splitting the family. By the mid-1970s, Carlo Gambino was not the man he had been when he took over the family in the aftermath of Albert Anastasia's murder nearly 20 years earlier. He had run the Gambino organization since 1957, with a reputation built on quiet control rather than open violence, staying out of headlines while other bosses courted attention. That reputation had made him, by most accounts, the most powerful crime boss in the country. But his health had been failing for years. He had suffered a series of heart attacks through the decade, and by 1975, those around him understood that his time running the family was coming to an end. Rather than wait for a sudden death to leave the organization without direction, Gambino began shifting real authority to the man he trusted most with the family's business interests. In 1975, he named Paul Castellano acting boss, a position that let Castellano begin running day-to-day operations while Gambino remained the official head of the family in name. It was during this same period, while Castellano was already functioning as the man effectively in charge, that one of the strangest and most telling episodes of his entire career took place. In 1975, Castellano's daughter Constance was dating a young man named Vito Borelli. Word reached Castellano that Borelli had made a comment comparing Castellano's appearance to Frank Perdue, the founder and television spokesman for Perdue Farms, a chicken company known across the country for commercials in which Perdue himself appeared on camera promoting his product. Castellano took the comparison as a personal insult. He ordered Borelli killed. For decades, the exact story behind Borelli's death remained mostly rumor inside organized crime circles, the kind of detail repeated among people close to the family without any court record to confirm it. That changed in 2004, when Joseph Massino, who had once served as boss of the Bonanno crime family before becoming a government witness, admitted in court documents that he had personally carried out the murder of Vito Borelli as a favor to Castellano. The admission confirmed what had circulated as rumor for years. A young man had been killed, at Castellano's order, carried out by a boss from an entirely different crime family, over a comment about a poultry company spokesman. It stands as one of the clearest examples of how far Castellano's authority reached, even before he officially held the title of boss, and how little separation there sometimes was between a personal insult and a death sentence inside the world he ran. Roughly a year after the Borelli killing, Gambino's health finally gave out completely. On the evening of October 14, 1976, Gambino watched the New York Yankees win the American League pennant on television at his home in Massapequa, Long Island. He died there in the early morning hours of October 15th, at the age of 74. The official cause of death was natural causes, tied directly to the heart disease that had been wearing him down for years. His wake was held that weekend at the Cusimano and Russo Funeral Home, and his funeral mass took place on Monday, October 18th, at the Church of Our Lady of Grace in Brooklyn. He was buried in his family's private room inside the Cloister Building at St. John's Cemetery in Queens. Several hundred people attended the funeral, with plainclothes police officers and FBI agents mixed quietly into the crowd, watching who showed up and who stood near whom. The funeral procession included 13 limousines and roughly a dozen private cars. The question everyone in the Gambino organization wanted answered was who would take over now that Gambino was gone. On paper, the obvious answer was Agnello Della Croce, who had served as Gambino's underboss and carried far deeper connections to the traditional, street-level side of the family's operations. The extortion, robbery, and loan sharking rackets that most soldiers and capos dealt with directly on a daily basis. Della Croce had spent years building relationships with the men who actually ran crews on the ground, and by most accounts, he had far more support among the rank-and-file membership than Castellano did. Gambino chose Castellano instead. It was, by almost every account from people close to the family at the time, a surprising decision. One that went against what most members expected, and, in the view of many, against what most members wanted. Gambino's reasoning appears to have centered on where he believed the family's future profits would come from. Castellano's decades of work building the Concrete Club, controlling Teamsters Local 282, and running legitimate-looking businesses like Dial Poultry had made him one of the family's most reliable earners, generating steady income through channels that were harder for law enforcement to trace and prosecute compared to the traditional street rackets Della Croce oversaw. Gambino appeared to believe the family would benefit more from a boss who thought like a businessman than from one who thought like a street soldier, even if that businessman lacked the same personal connections to the men who would have to follow him. There was a complication working against Della Croce at the exact moment this decision needed to be made. At the time of Gambino's death, Della Croce was in federal prison on a tax evasion conviction, physically unable to contest the succession even if he had wanted to fight for it. By the time he was released and able to respond to what had happened, Castellano's position as the new boss had already been set in motion. The succession was formally confirmed at a meeting held on November 24, 1976, with a recently released Della Croce present in the room. Whatever frustration Della Croce carried into that meeting, he did not act on it by challenging Castellano outright. Instead, the two men worked out an arrangement meant to keep the family functioning under a shared leadership structure. Castellano would remain the official boss of the entire organization, but Della Croce would stay on as underboss, directly running the traditional Cosa Nostra activities, extortion, robbery, and loan sharking that made up the daily bread and butter of most soldiers and capos in the family. Castellano, meanwhile, would keep control over the white-collar side of the operation, the construction rackets, union contracts, and business interests he had spent decades building. On the surface, the arrangement looked like a reasonable compromise, a way to give both men authority over the parts of the organization where they had the most experience and the most trust. In practice, it created a divide inside the Gambino family that never fully closed. Della Croce's men, based largely out of Manhattan, continued to operate the way organized crime had operated for generations, dealing directly with the kind of street-level violence and old-school rackets that had built the American Mafia's reputation in the first place. Castellano's own faction, centered more around his interests on Staten Island and in Brooklyn, moved further and further away from that world, focused instead on construction contracts, labor union control, and legitimate-looking business fronts. The family had one boss on paper, but it was functioning, in practice, as two separate organizations loosely connected by an agreement worked out at a single meeting in November 1976. That divide mattered more than it might have in an earlier era of the Gambino family, because the two men leading each side had almost nothing in common in terms of temperament or worldview. Castellano had spent his entire adult life trying to distance organized crime from its old, violent reputation, building businesses that looked, on paper, like ordinary companies paying ordinary taxes. He preferred negotiation, financial control, and quiet arrangements worked out over meetings rather than street confrontations. Della Croce, and the men who looked up to him, still believed in the older model. One built on loyalty earned through shared risk on the street, muscle applied when a problem needed solving quickly, and a much more hands-on relationship between a boss and the soldiers who worked under him. Among the younger capos aligned with Della Croce's side of the family was a rising figure named John Gotti, a man who had come up through exactly the kind of street-level crew work that Castellano had spent his career trying to move away from. One specific policy set by Gambino years earlier, and kept in place after Castellano took over, would end up sitting directly at the center of the tension building between these two factions. Gambino had instituted a strict rule against drug dealing inside the family, a policy some members referred to as deal and die, meaning that any member caught trafficking narcotics could expect to be killed for it. Gambino's reasoning was practical rather than moral. Narcotics cases carried extremely long federal prison sentences, and men facing decades behind bars had far more incentive to cooperate with prosecutors and inform on their own organization to reduce their time. A family built on strict silence could not afford members with that kind of pressure hanging over them. Castellano kept the same policy in place once he became boss, publicly banning drug trafficking among Gambino members, just as Gambino had. The problem was that the money available in the cocaine and heroin trade by the late 1970s and early 1980s had grown enormous, far larger than anything most street-level rackets could match. and a significant number of Gambino members, particularly younger men aligned with Della Croce's Manhattan faction, were dealing drugs anyway, quietly, in direct violation of family policy, because the profits were simply too large to walk away from. Castellano, sitting on Staten Island running his construction and union interests, remained largely disconnected from just how widespread that violation had become among the men technically still under his authority. That gap between what Castellano believed his family's rules required and what a significant portion of his own membership was actually doing in the streets of Manhattan would, within a few years, become one of the central forces pulling his own organization apart from the inside. For the moment, in the years immediately following his rise to boss, Castellano's position looked secure. He held the top title in what was widely regarded as the most powerful of New York's 5 families. He had inherited a business empire worth enormous sums of money, built over decades through construction rackets, labor union control, and legitimate-looking companies that gave the family both profit and legal cover. He had an underboss who had, at least publicly, accepted his succession without open rebellion. And he had years of experience showing him exactly how to keep that machine running without drawing unnecessary attention from law enforcement. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What Castellano had less of, compared to the men who had built the Gambino family's reputation before him, was a personal connection to the street-level soldiers who made up the bulk of his organization. The same men Della Croce had spent his career working alongside. That distance between Castellano and his own membership, present from the very first day he took the title of boss, would only grow wider in the years that followed, as Castellano moved further into a lifestyle that looked less like a mob boss and more like a wealthy businessman living behind the walls of a mansion far removed from the streets his family still operated in. Section 4. Family Blood. The murders of Schibetta and his own son-in-law. By the late 1970s, Paul Castellano had built more than a business empire. He had also built an enforcement system, a group of men willing to carry out his orders quietly and without leaving evidence behind. At the center of that system sat a Gambino soldier named Roy DeMeo, working under Capo Anthony Nino Gaggi. DeMeo ran a crew based out of a bar called the Gemini Lounge in the Flatlands section of Brooklyn. And over the course of roughly a decade, that crew was tied to somewhere between 70 and 200 killings, most of them connected to a stolen car ring the crew operated on the side. When Castellano needed a problem removed, and needed it removed cleanly, DeMeo's crew was often the group he turned to. 2 of the killings that crew carried out on Castellano's orders did not involve rival gangsters or federal informants. They involved people connected to his own family by blood and by marriage. The first case involved a young man named Nicholas Schibetta, known to people around him as Little Nicky. Schibetta was the younger brother of Deborah Gravano, the wife of Gambino soldier Salvatore Gravano, a man who would later become known publicly as Sammy the Bull, after he turned government witness in the early 1990s. Schibetta grew up in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, the same neighborhood where Gravano himself was raised. And by his early 20s, he had developed a serious problem with cocaine and alcohol. That addiction fed a pattern of reckless behavior that repeatedly embarrassed the people connected to him. He got into a public fight at a nightclub owned by a Gambino capo, an incident serious enough that police were called to break it up. In a separate incident, he got into a physical altercation with the son of another Gambino associate, lost the fight, and then went to the police to report it. A decision that, in the world he lived in, marked him as someone willing to involve law enforcement in disputes that were supposed to stay inside the family. On top of the drug use and the police involvement, Schibetta insulted the daughter of George DeCicco, a Gambino associate and relative of soldier Frank DeCicco. Word of each of these incidents made its way up the chain to Castellano. Castellano decided Schibetta had become too much of a liability to the family's discipline, and gave the order to have him killed. Because Schibetta was Gravano's brother-in-law, Castellano told Frank DeCicco to notify Gravano before the murder happened, rather than letting him find out afterward. When Gravano learned what was coming, he reacted with fury, reportedly saying he would kill Castellano himself rather than let his wife's brother be murdered. DeCicco talked him down, warning him plainly that going to war with the boss of the family was a death sentence with no chance of winning. Gravano eventually backed away from that threat and accepted that Schibetta's death would go forward. According to Gravano's later testimony, the killing was carried out in 1978 by members of his own crew, associates named Liborio Milito and Joseph D'Angelo, working under a contract Castellano had approved. Schibetta's body was never recovered whole. Only a hand was later found, and Gravano attended a funeral held for that single remaining piece of his wife's brother. Gravano kept his own role in the killing hidden from his wife Deborah for more than a decade, until his testimony during John Gotti's 1992 racketeering trial revealed what had actually happened. The Schibetta case set a pattern that would repeat 2 years later, this time involving someone connected to Castellano through his own daughter. Constance Castellano, known to her family as Connie, had married a man named Frank Amato. Amato came from a working-class Brooklyn background and had worked as a hijacker, stealing goods off trucks moving through the area around John F. Kennedy Airport, before marrying into the Castellano family. In a large, traditional Sicilian-style wedding, attended by many of the most powerful men in the Gambino organization, Castellano tried to set his new son-in-law up as a legitimate businessman, first backing him as a distributor of Italian ice, a venture that failed. Castellano then moved Amato into the family's meat business, putting him to work at the Meat Palace butcher shop chain that Castellano and his sons owned and operated. According to Boss of Bosses, a book written by 2 FBI agents who investigated Castellano directly, Amato was taught at these butcher shops how to disguise and resell meat that should have been thrown away, using chemical treatments and false grading stamps to make old, spoiled product look fresh enough to sell. That practice eventually drew the attention of federal investigators running an operation aimed specifically at the Castellano family's control over the East Coast wholesale meat market. Whatever business problems Amato caused, they were not what ended his life. His marriage to Connie became abusive. Amato struck her on multiple occasions, and one of those incidents was serious enough to cause a miscarriage. On top of the violence, Amato was caught having an affair with a female coworker at one of the Castellano-owned meat businesses. When Nino Gaggi reported the affair up the chain, Castellano had the female employee fired and forced Amato out of the family's Tot Hill mansion, effectively ending the marriage. But losing his position in the household and his job at the meat business was not the end of the consequences Amato faced. Castellano gave the order to have him killed. On September 20th, 1980, Amato was lured to the Gemini Lounge in Flatlands, Brooklyn, under the pretense of discussing a business deal with Roy DeMeo. Once he arrived, DeMeo shot him to death. Members of DeMeo's crew, including Henry Borelli, Anthony Center, Joseph Testa, and brothers Frederick and Richard Denome, then dismembered his body. Using a cabin cruiser owned by Richard Denome, the crew took Amato's remains several miles out into the ocean and disposed of them at sea. His body was never recovered, and he was legally declared dead 5 years later in 1985. Years afterward, Castellano and several members of the DeMeo crew were charged in connection with Amato's disappearance and presumed murder, but no one was ever convicted in the case. Connie eventually remarried to a man named Joseph Catalanati, and the couple settled into a house on Tot Hill, not far from her father's own mansion, and had a daughter together. The Amato killing was not an isolated case of Castellano protecting his family through violence. It fit inside a broader pattern of how he used Gaggi and DeMeo's crew to remove people who threatened the internal balance of the organization, whether that threat came from outside the family or from within it. Around this same period, a Gambino capo named James Ippolito complained to Castellano that fellow capo Nino Gaggi was moving into territory Ippolito considered his own, and Ippolito asked Castellano for permission to have Gaggi killed. Castellano gave Ippolito a vague, non-committal answer, but then quietly warned Gaggi about what Ippolito was planning. In response, Gaggi and DeMeo killed both Ippolito and his son. It was a pattern that repeated across multiple cases during these years. A problem would surface inside the organization, word would reach Castellano, and DeMeo's crew would be sent to solve it permanently, with almost no regard for how closely the target was connected to Castellano personally. What set the Schibetta and Amato cases apart from most of the other killings tied to Castellano was how directly they cut into his own family. Schibetta was the brother-in-law of one of his own soldiers, a man whose wife had grown up alongside the family Castellano ran. Amato had been married to Castellano's own daughter, had sat at Castellano's own dinner table, and had worked inside businesses Castellano personally controlled. In both cases, Castellano chose to enforce the same rules on people connected to him by blood or marriage that he applied to any other member of his organization. Addiction, public embarrassment, and violence against a Castellano daughter were treated as offenses that demanded the same lethal response as any threat from outside the family. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By 1980, Castellano had spent 4 years running the Gambino organization, building a reputation as a boss who preferred quiet business deals over street violence, while at the same time relying on one of the most efficient killing crews in the history of organized crime to enforce discipline whenever his own rules were broken, even inside his own household. That contradiction, a businessman's public image sitting on top of a private willingness to order the deaths of people close to him, would become even harder to ignore in the years that followed, once federal investigators found a way to look directly inside the walls of Castellano's own home. Section 5. The White House on Staten Island, and the maid who became his downfall. While Castellano was quietly using Roy DeMeo's crew to enforce discipline inside his own family, he was also building something that would come to define his public image more than any single act of violence ever could. In 1976, the same year he took over the Gambino family from Carlo Gambino, Castellano began construction on a private mansion in Tot Hill, the highest and most exclusive neighborhood on Staten Island. It took 4 years to finish. By the time it was complete in 1980, the property sat on roughly 1 3/4 acres at 177 Benedict Road, and reports on its final cost placed the figure somewhere around $3.5 million, a huge sum of money for a private residence at the time. The finished house stretched across tens of thousands of square feet, built with 8 bedrooms and 17 bathrooms, a design meant to echo a formal Italian palazzo rather than an ordinary American home. The foyer and dining room were lined with Carrara marble imported specifically for the project. The property included both an indoor and an outdoor swimming pool built to Olympic proportions, a manicured English garden, an Italian fountain, and a 13-car garage. Castellano modeled the exterior on the White House in Washington, D.C., complete with tall white columns framing the entrance, a choice deliberate enough that both the men who worked for him and the federal agents who later investigated him started calling the property the White House. The comparison was not accidental, and it was not simply a matter of the columns and the driveway. Castellano wanted a home that communicated exactly what he believed he had become. Not a street boss running a criminal gang, but something closer to a head of state, presiding over an organization with its own internal government, its own laws, and its own court. Visitors who came up the driveway understood the message immediately. A former Gambino capo later described the effect the house had on anyone arriving there for the first time, saying it made clear, without a word being spoken, that the man living inside considered himself above the men waiting outside his door. Even the kitchen reflected that same ambition towards scale and formality. Built to commercial-grade specifications, it was large enough to prepare meals for dozens of guests at once. A detail that made sense given Castellano's decades in the wholesale meat and butchering business, and given how often the mansion hosted large gatherings of capos and associates who came to pay tribute or receive instructions. The house was more than a display of wealth. It became the physical center of how Castellano ran the entire Gambino organization during his years as boss. Where earlier crime bosses had built their reputations on visibility, on walking the same streets and social clubs as their soldiers, Castellano did nearly the opposite. He rarely left the mansion at all. Instead of visiting his capos out in the neighborhoods where they worked, he summoned them to Tot Hill and gave his orders from inside his own dining room, the same room that would later become the center of a major federal investigation. He spent his days at home in silk dressing gowns and velvet slippers, a lifestyle so removed from the traditional image of a street-level mob boss that some of the men who worked for him began comparing him, only half-joking, to Howard Hughes, the reclusive billionaire who spent his final years hidden away from public view. That comparison went beyond the joking stage for some of the men whose loyalty Castellano depended on. A boss who could not be found on the street, who never showed up at the social clubs where deals were struck and disputes settled face-to-face, was a boss increasingly known to his own soldiers only through second-hand reports and occasional summons to a mansion most of them visited only when called. To help pay for the mansion and the lifestyle that came with it, Castellano reportedly raised the standard tribute he demanded from his capos, pushing the usual cut of their earnings from around 10% up to 15%. A change that did not go unnoticed by the men who now had to hand over more of their own money to support a boss they rarely even saw in person. For men used to a more traditional relationship with the top of their organization, one built on personal loyalty earned through shared risk and regular contact, watching their own earnings shrink to fund a mansion they were rarely invited inside of created exactly the kind of quiet resentment that tends to calcify over years, rather than explode in a single moment. It was inside this mansion, in 1979, that Castellano met the woman who would become the single most consequential figure in his final years. Gloria Olarte had arrived in New York from Medellin, Colombia on a tourist visa, working an ordinary job at a candy company alongside her sister Nellie. Nellie heard about a possible housekeeping position through the factory where she worked, whose owner apparently had connections to wealthy families with private chauffeurs. One day, a man arrived in a limousine and picked up Gloria, her sister, and a friend. And some months later, Gloria received a phone call telling her the job had come through. She was driven, again by limousine, to the newly built Castellano estate on Todd Hill, where she was hired as a live-in housekeeper. Castellano was 64 years old at the time. His wife of more than 4 decades, Nina Mano, still lived in the house alongside him. Gloria herself later described the property to reporters in terms that made clear how overwhelming it must have felt to a young immigrant arriving for a housekeeping job. The mansion had its own apartment set aside for domestic staff, waiting rooms for visitors, and a scale that made the candy factory job she had left behind feel like a different life entirely. She was, by her own description, a slender woman in her early 30s, with straight dark hair, still adjusting to a new country when she found herself living inside one of the largest private residences in New York City, working for a man whose real occupation she did not yet understand. At first, the relationship between Castellano and his new housekeeper was purely functional. Gloria spoke little English when she arrived, which created communication problems in the early months of her employment. Castellano reportedly solved this by bringing home a small computer device that let him leave her written instructions, which she would then translate into Spanish to understand what was being asked of her. The earliest messages were simple, direct commands tied to her job. Set the table, make the coffee, bring fruit. Over time, according to accounts Gloria later gave to reporters, the tone of those messages began to shift. Compliments started appearing among the instructions. Personal comments began replacing simple orders. Small remarks about her appearance woven in between requests about the household's daily routine. The working relationship between a wealthy, aging mob boss and his young Colombian housekeeper turned into something else entirely, developing into a full romantic affair that continued for years while Castellano's wife remained living in the same house. Years later, once the affair and everything that followed it had become public knowledge through court proceedings and media coverage, Gloria picked up a nickname among people who wrote about the case: the Yoko Ono of the mob. A comparison meant to capture how directly her presence in the household was blamed for the unraveling of Castellano's marriage, and, indirectly, for some of the internal resentment that built against him inside his own organization. It was an unusually specific kind of notoriety for a woman who had arrived in the country only a few years earlier looking for ordinary domestic work. Inside the world Castellano operated in, this kind of arrangement broke a set of unwritten rules that had governed how organized crime figures were expected to handle their personal lives for generations. A mafioso having a mistress outside his marriage was not considered unusual or even particularly scandalous among the men in Castellano's circle. What mattered, under those unwritten rules, was discretion. A mistress was expected to remain separate from a boss's household, kept away from his wife, his children, and the daily life of his family, so that the wife's position and dignity inside that family were never publicly threatened or embarrassed. There was an old, informal understanding among the men in Castellano's world about the specific roles a wife and a mistress each occupied, one tied to something as small and symbolic as who prepared the family's meals. The boss's wife, by long custom, was the one who made the sauce for the pasta served to guests and capos. A mistress simply did not belong in that kitchen at all, let alone living under the same roof as the woman whose place she was quietly displacing. Gloria Olarte's situation violated nearly every part of that expectation at once. She did not live somewhere separate from the family. She lived inside the same house as Nina Castellano, worked in the same kitchen, and was present at the same gatherings where Gambino family members came to meet with their boss. Members of the family began talking among themselves about how openly Castellano was disgracing his wife by keeping his mistress under the same roof, present in front of the same capos who came to Tot Hill, expecting to find a traditional, respected household running the most powerful crime family in New York. Whatever business Castellano intended to conduct during those visits, the men arriving at his door could not help noticing the two women moving through the same kitchen, competing, without quite saying so, for the same small domestic responsibilities that, in the world they came from, were never supposed to overlap. Tension between Nina and Gloria grew as the years passed, playing out in small domestic disputes inside the mansion's kitchen, where both women found themselves trying to serve and care for the same man under the same roof. At one point, in a moment of anger, Gloria packed 2 plastic bags full of her clothes and left the estate for a hotel in New York City. That same night, Castellano traveled to the hotel with 5 men and asked her to come back. According to an account Gloria gave to the Washington Post years later, she agreed to return only on one condition: that from then on, she would enter the mansion through the main front entrance rather than the back door normally used by household staff. Castellano agreed to her demand. That single decision carried more weight inside the household than its size might suggest. The front entrance of the mansion was the same columned White House-style entrance visitors used when arriving for meetings with the boss himself. The same doorway capos and soldiers passed through when they came to pay tribute. Assigning that entrance to a live-in housekeeper, rather than reserving it for family and honored guests, was a visible, daily reminder of exactly whose position inside the household had changed. When word of that decision reached Nina, she understood exactly what it meant about her own position inside her own home. In 1983, after roughly 4 years of living alongside her husband's open affair, Nina Mano Castellano left the mansion and left her husband, ending a marriage that had lasted since 1937, A marriage that had carried Castellano from a young capo working under Albert Anastasia all the way to the head of the most powerful crime family in the country. Castellano's relationship with Gloria continued in the years that followed, even as his legal situation grew increasingly serious and his own life expectancy, given the world he operated in, grew shorter. After Castellano was released on $2 million bail following his 1984 federal racketeering indictment, Gloria later recalled a conversation in which Castellano asked her directly whether she understood who he really was. He told her he belonged to the mafia and asked if that frightened her. She told him it did not. He went on to tell her something else during that same period, a comment she would remember clearly after everything that followed. That men in his position, men who had made as many decisions and enemies as he had over the course of a long criminal career, tended to die out on the street rather than quietly at home. That comment turned out to be exactly right. Long after Castellano's death, questions remained about a piece of the story that connected directly back to Gloria's presence inside the household. Questions that were never fully settled even by the people closest to the investigation. Federal agents eventually found a way into the mansion's most private rooms, gathering hundreds of hours of recorded conversation that would help bring down the very organization Castellano had built his entire adult life around. Exactly how much Gloria herself may have known about or even assisted with the operation that placed listening devices inside the kitchen where she worked every day remains disputed among the people who have written about the case. A detail that would only come into sharper focus once investigators finally moved from watching Castellano's household from the outside to listening in on it directly. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Beyond the personal betrayal it represented inside his marriage, the entire Gloria Olarte situation carried consequences that reached far beyond Castellano's own household. Consequences neither he nor his mistress could have fully understood while they were living through it. Section 6. The Bug in the Kitchen. In January 1983, Roy DeMeo turned up dead. His body was found inside the trunk of his own Cadillac, shot 5 times behind both ears. No one was ever convicted for his killing, but the men close to the situation understood exactly what had happened and why. DeMeo had spent years running one of the most active killing crews inside the entire Gambino organization, tied to somewhere between 70 and 200 murders, connected largely to a stolen car ring he operated on the side. The ring shipped stolen vehicles overseas using forged documents and doctored vehicle identification numbers, an operation sophisticated enough that it eventually drew the attention of federal investigators working under United States Attorney Rudolph Giuliani, the same office that would soon turn its full weight against Castellano himself. By late 1982, that car ring had drawn heavy federal attention, and Castellano had grown concerned that DeMeo, facing serious prison time if the investigation continued, might eventually decide to cooperate with prosecutors, rather than accept the consequences alone. DeMeo was not an ordinary soldier who could simply disappear without notice. He was one of the most productive and most feared men inside the entire organization, a person whose crew had carried out killings on Castellano's own direct orders going back years, including the deaths of Nicholas Schibetta and Frank Amato. That history made DeMeo useful to Castellano for a long time. It also made him dangerous the moment his own freedom came under threat. Because a man who had personally overseen so much of the organization's violence knew more than almost anyone else about how deeply that violence connected back to the boss who had ordered so much of it. Castellano allegedly gave the order to have DeMeo killed before that could happen. The man who had carried out so many of Castellano's own orders over the previous decade became one more name on the list of people removed to protect the organization from exposure. A pattern that had already claimed Nicholas Schibetta, Frank Amato, and James Ippolito and his son in the years before. There was a grim symmetry to the killing. DeMeo had spent a career eliminating people whose continued existence posed a risk to Castellano's organization, and in the end, he became exactly that kind of risk himself. Judged too dangerous to leave alive once federal investigators closed in on the operation he ran. DeMeo's death did nothing to slow the federal investigation closing in around Castellano. If anything, it marked the beginning of the end. 2 months later, in March 1983, the FBI obtained a warrant to install secret listening devices directly inside Castellano's Staten Island mansion. The same White House where he had spent years running his organization from behind closed gates. Believing the property gave him both privacy and distance from the risks other bosses took by conducting business out in the open. 2 special agents, Joseph O'Brien and Andres Currens, had spent roughly 4 years building toward this exact opportunity, studying Castellano's habits and movements closely enough to know when a window would open. Their work on the case had been methodical rather than sudden, built through years of watching who came and went from the mansion, learning the household's routines, and waiting for a moment when Castellano's usual defenses would be down long enough to act. That window came when Castellano left for a vacation in Florida. While he was away, agents drugged the watchdogs guarding the property, disabled the mansion's security system, and planted listening devices inside the rooms where Castellano actually conducted his business. The kitchen and dining room where he ate his meals, held meetings with his capos, and spoke freely about matters he believed were happening entirely behind closed doors. One device was reportedly built into a lamp sitting on the kitchen table, hidden in plain sight in a room Castellano and his household passed through constantly throughout each day. O'Brien was later credited as one of the 2 agents who first found a way to penetrate the mansion and make the entire operation possible. Work recognized in 1987 when he received the Attorney General's Distinguished Service Award, one of the highest honors available to a law enforcement officer in the country. The recognition reflected just how difficult the operation had been to pull off against a target as cautious and well-guarded as Castellano had become by the early 1980s. The operation worked exactly as the FBI hoped. Over the roughly 6 months that followed, the devices captured more than 600 hours of recorded conversation, an enormous amount of material touching on nearly every aspect of how Castellano ran the Gambino family. Currens spent months monitoring the ongoing recordings and supervising the long, painstaking process of transcribing hundreds of hours of tape into usable written evidence, a task that required listening closely enough to catch names, locations, and specific criminal acts buried inside hours of ordinary household conversation, family meals, and the day-to-day chatter of a busy mansion. What the recordings captured went far beyond simple business talk. They caught Castellano discussing illegal deals with the men who worked under him, giving orders, settling disputes, and revealing details about the inner workings of an organization that had operated largely in the shadows for decades. They also captured far more personal material, including conversations tied to his relationship with Gloria Olarte, the same affair that had already driven his wife out of the mansion 2 years earlier. For an investigation built around exposing how deeply Castellano controlled the Gambino family's business, the tapes turned out to be an almost unmatched source of evidence, all of it recorded in Castellano's own voice, inside his own home, without him ever suspecting the extent of what was being captured. The recordings eventually formed the foundation for evidence used across 8 separate criminal trials touching different parts of the Gambino organization, a scale of impact that few single surveillance operations in the history of American organized crime prosecution had ever achieved. O'Brien and Currens later wrote about the operation themselves in a book titled Boss of Bosses, describing not just the mechanics of the surveillance, but the strange, almost personal familiarity they developed with a man they had spent years listening to without his knowledge. A target who came across in his own recorded voice as sharper, funnier, and more self-aware than either agent had initially expected from a man running one of the country's most violent criminal organizations. The mansion bug was not the only surveillance operation closing in on Castellano's organization at the same time. Separately, federal investigators had been listening in on the home telephone of Angelo Ruggiero, a Gambino soldier and close friend of John Gotti since as early as 1980. Ruggiero was known among people close to him as a non-stop talker, a trait that earned him the nickname Quack Quack. And over the years that wiretap ran, he was recorded discussing a wide range of family business over the phone, including active drug deals that directly violated the standing Gambino family policy against narcotics trafficking. Investigators and journalists who later reviewed the material referred to the entire collection of recordings pulled from Ruggiero's phone as the Quack Quack tapes, a nickname that stuck because of just how much Ruggiero talked, and how little care he seemed to take about what he said or who might eventually be listening. In the same recorded conversations, Ruggiero was also caught speaking with open contempt about Castellano himself, referring to his own boss using insulting terms that made clear how little respect he actually held for the man running the organization he belonged to. Among the terms Ruggiero used to describe Castellano on tape were a pansy and a milk drinker, phrases meant to mock Castellano's preference for negotiation and business dealings over the more traditional, physically confrontational style of leadership men like Ruggiero associated with real authority inside the mob. Hearing those exact words repeated back to him, whether through the wiretap evidence itself or through second-hand reports of what the recordings contained, would have told Castellano something his own instincts likely already suspected: that a meaningful portion of his own membership, particularly the younger, more street-oriented soldiers aligned with the Manhattan faction, viewed him not as a respected boss, but as an out-of-touch figurehead unworthy of the position his cousin had handed him nearly a decade earlier. In August 1983, that wiretap led directly to arrests. Ruggiero and Gene Gotti, John Gotti's brother, were both taken into custody and charged with heroin trafficking, based largely on the recordings pulled from the device inside Ruggiero's own house. Under standard legal procedure, anyone charged with a crime based on wiretap evidence has the right to review the actual transcripts of those recordings as part of preparing a defense. Ruggiero received boxes of transcript material covering months of his own recorded conversations. Word of what those transcripts might contain reached Castellano quickly, and he made it clear he wanted to see them for himself. If members of his own family were dealing drugs in direct violation of the rule he had inherited and continued to enforce, he wanted to know exactly who was involved and how deep the violation ran. Ruggiero refused to hand the transcripts over. His reasons were not hard to guess. Buried somewhere inside those hundreds of pages were almost certainly the same disrespectful comments about Castellano that investigators had already picked up on the wiretap. Remarks that could cost Ruggiero far more than a prison sentence, if his own boss read them directly. Handing Castellano boxes of transcripts filled with insults directed at him personally, on top of clear evidence of drug dealing that violated one of the family's oldest and most strictly enforced rules, risked turning a legal problem into a much more immediate and personal one. When Castellano's demand for the tapes went nowhere, his frustration turned toward the man closest to Ruggiero inside the organization. He threatened to demote John Gotti, stripping him of his position as a Gambino capo as a way of applying pressure on Ruggiero to comply. The threat placed Gotti in an impossible position. He could not force his own close friend to hand over evidence that might expose them both to serious consequences, and he could not ignore a direct threat from the boss of the entire family without risking his own standing inside the organization. Agnello della Croce, still serving as underboss at this point despite his own declining health, found himself caught in the middle of the dispute as well, trying to shield Gotti's crew from Castellano's mounting anger, while also managing Castellano's temper directly, aware that pushing the boss too hard over an issue this sensitive could have consequences reaching well beyond a simple demotion. The dispute over a set of legal transcripts, born out of an ordinary criminal case working its way through the federal court system, had turned into a direct confrontation between Castellano and one of the most capable, most respected capos in his own Manhattan faction. A confrontation that simmered without resolution for months, while both sides waited to see who would move first. While that private standoff played out between Castellano, Ruggiero, and Gotti, the broader federal case against Castellano himself continued moving forward on its own separate track. On March 30th, 1984, Castellano was formally indicted on federal racketeering charges, along with a long list of additional counts including extortion, drug trafficking, theft, prostitution, and the murders of James Ippolito and Roy DeMeo. The indictment drew directly on evidence gathered from the mansion bug, tying Castellano's own recorded words to specific criminal acts prosecutors could now bring in front of a jury. He was released on $2 million bail while the case moved through the courts, but the scale of the charges made clear that federal prosecutors now had access to a level of direct evidence against him that had never existed in any previous investigation over his entire criminal career. Unlike his earlier brushes with the law, going back to the Apalachin arrest in 1957 and the loan sharking case that collapsed in 1975 when a key witness refused to testify, this case did not depend on a single cooperating witness who might change his mind or disappear. It depended on hundreds of hours of Castellano's own recorded voice, evidence that could not recant, could not be intimidated, and could not simply vanish, the way earlier witnesses against him sometimes had. The pressure only increased the following year. On February 25, 1985, Castellano was arrested again, this time as one of several major organized crime bosses swept up together in what would become known as the Mafia Commission Trial, a case built around the idea that the ruling body overseeing New York's 5 families could itself be prosecuted as a criminal enterprise under federal racketeering law. 9 of the most powerful organized crime figures in New York were named in that same indictment, tying Castellano's fate directly to the fate of his counterparts running the Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo families. Men whose own operations had little day-to-day connection to Castellano's, but who now shared a courtroom, a legal strategy, and a set of shared exposure alongside him. Castellano was released on $3 million bail following that arrest. But between the March 1984 indictment and the February 1985 commission case arrest, he now faced the very real possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison, based largely on evidence recorded from inside his own home. The legal process created a second consequence that turned out to matter just as much as the criminal charges themselves. Under the same discovery rules that had forced Ruggiero to receive transcripts of his own recorded conversations, every person named as a defendant in the cases built from the mansion bug and other related wiretaps had a legal right to review the evidence being used against them, including transcripts of Castellano's own recorded conversations. That meant capos, soldiers, and associates across the Gambino family suddenly had access to hours of Castellano speaking candidly about them, their work, and their standing inside the organization. Material he had never intended anyone outside a small circle to hear. Men who had spent years showing loyalty to Castellano now found themselves reading transcripts of their own boss discussing them in terms that were often dismissive, critical, or simply indifferent. For an organization that ran almost entirely on personal loyalty and respect passed down through direct relationships, hearing exactly how little some of those relationships seemed to matter to the man at the top did lasting damage to Castellano's standing among men who had once been counted as his most reliable supporters. The damage went in both directions at once. Just as Castellano's own men were reading transcripts of him speaking dismissively about their work and their value to the organization, Castellano himself was learning, through his own legal team and through the slow, painful process of discovery, exactly how his own soldiers spoke about him when they believed he could not hear them. A relationship built for decades on the assumption of mutual, if sometimes distant, respect was replaced almost overnight with hard evidence of exactly how thin that respect had actually become on both sides. Loyalty inside an organization like the Gambino family had always depended heavily on what men believed about one another rather than what they could prove. And the Mansion bug and the Ruggiero wiretap together stripped away that uncertainty for good, replacing it with transcripts neither side could take back or explain away. By the time these two investigations, the Mansion bug and the Ruggiero wiretap, had run their course, Castellano's legal situation and his internal standing inside the Gambino family were both far worse than they had been just 2 years earlier. He was facing federal charges serious enough to end his life outside prison walls entirely. He was locked in an unresolved standoff with Ruggiero and Gotti over a set of transcripts he still had not seen. And a significant portion of his own membership now had direct, recorded proof of exactly how their boss spoke about them when he believed no one outside his closest circle was listening. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One more event, arriving from an entirely different direction just months later, would turn all of that accumulated tension into something Castellano would not survive. Section 7. The death of Della Croce and a conspiracy takes shape. By early 1985, the pressure building against Paul Castellano had spread well beyond his own household. On February 25, 1985, Castellano was arrested along with the leaders of New York's other major crime families as part of a sweeping federal case that would become known as the Mafia Commission Trial, an effort to prosecute the ruling body overseeing the five families as a single criminal enterprise under federal racketeering law. He was released on $3 million bail. That same period brought a second, separate legal blow that struck even closer to home. On March 28, 1985, Aniello Della Croce, Castellano's own underboss, was indicted alongside his son Armand and 8 others on federal racketeering charges tied to the activities of 2 crews operating across New York and Long Island over the previous 18 years. The man Castellano had spent 9 years sharing power with, the one figure inside the organization capable of holding the more volatile members of the family in check, was now facing the same kind of prosecution closing in on Castellano himself. Della Croce's own history with federal law enforcement stretched back decades before this final indictment. He had first been jailed as a young man for petty theft after growing up in the Little Italy section of Manhattan, the American-born son of Italian immigrants who Americanized his given name, Aniello, into the nickname Neil that most of the organization knew him by. In 1971, he was sentenced to a year in state prison on contempt charges after refusing to answer grand jury questions about organized crime, echoing the same kind of silence that had defined Castellano's own early legal troubles decades earlier. A year later, in 1972, he was indicted on federal tax evasion charges tied to thousands of dollars in stock he had received from a plastics company in exchange for labor peace, a case that resulted in a 5-year prison sentence and a substantial fine by 1973. In 1979, Della Croce was arrested alongside an associate named Anthony Plate in connection with the 1974 murder of a New York City bookmaker, a case the FBI believed Della Croce had ordered, because the victim was suspected of informing on the organization. That case ended in a mistrial after Plate himself disappeared during the proceedings. One more unresolved thread in a career defined by exactly the kind of violence Castellano had spent his own years trying to distance himself from. That contrast in style was part of what made Della Croce such an effective, if uneasy, partner for Castellano over the years. According to one federal agent who studied him closely, Della Croce was said to take genuine pleasure in violence, described as someone who liked to watch a victim's face at the moment of death, the way another man might study a painting. He had joined the old Mangano crime family in the late 1930s and worked his way up under Albert Anastasia, earning a reputation inside the organization built on exactly the kind of physical fear that Castellano's own business-minded approach had never relied on. He sometimes walked around Manhattan disguised as a priest, calling himself Father O'Neill, a habit meant to confuse both police and rival mobsters trying to track his movements. He bought a Little Italy storefront that became the Ravenite Social Club, which functioned for years as his own personal headquarters and later as one of the most heavily surveilled organized crime locations in the entire country. Despite this reputation for brutality, Della Croce also carried a deep, old-fashioned belief in loyalty and tradition, values that made him unwilling to move against Castellano, even when he privately agreed with the men under him that Castellano's leadership had grown out of touch. Della Croce's health had already been declining before that indictment arrived. He was 71 years old and suffering from lung cancer, a disease that had been wearing him down for some time, even as he continued functioning as underboss and mentor to the younger capos under his wing. Throughout the years since Carlo Gambino's death in 1976, Della Croce had played a role inside the Gambino family that went far beyond simply running his own faction. He was widely seen, even by men who disagreed with him on other matters, as a kind of peacemaker between Castellano's white-collar wing of the organization and the younger, more street-focused capos who resented Castellano's leadership. Chief among those younger capos was John Gotti, a man who had come up through Della Croce's own crew and treated him with something close to open admiration. Gotti disagreed sharply with Castellano's continued ban on drug trafficking, a rule that cut directly against the enormous profits available in the narcotics trade during the early 1980s. And Gotti and his own crew, including his close friend Angelo Ruggiero, had been dealing drugs quietly for years, despite the standing family policy against it. Della Croce, for his part, followed Castellano's orders and did not personally involve himself in narcotics. But he also never allowed the growing frustration among his own men to turn into open rebellion against Castellano, largely because Gotti and the others deferred to Della Croce's judgment and were unwilling to move against the family's leadership while he remained alive to object. That restraint disappeared on December 2, 1985, when Della Croce died at Mary Immaculate Hospital in Queens. He was buried at St. John's Cemetery, the same cemetery where Carlo Gambino himself had been laid to rest 9 years earlier. With Della Croce gone, the one figure capable of holding Gotti and the other dissatisfied capos in check was no longer there to do it. Federal investigators watching the situation from the outside understood almost immediately how significant this loss was to the fragile balance holding the Gambino family together. Members of Della Croce's own faction were reportedly already voicing concern in the days after his death that Castellano would begin favoring his own loyalists even more openly now that the one man capable of pushing back against him was no longer in the room. Castellano made two decisions in the days that followed Della Croce's death that, taken together, turned that quiet concern into an active conspiracy against his own life. The first decision was less an action than a failure to act. Castellano did not attend Della Croce's wake. For an organization built almost entirely around visible displays of respect, loyalty, and proper deference to rank and relationship, skipping the wake of the family's own underboss, a man who had served loyally under both Gambino and Castellano for nearly a decade despite deep personal reservations about Castellano's leadership, was read by nearly everyone connected to Della Croce as a deliberate insult. It did not matter to the men who noticed the absence whether Castellano had a practical reason for staying away, such as concerns about federal surveillance given his own pending trial. What mattered was the message the absence sent to an entire faction of the family that was already primed to see Castellano as distant, arrogant, and indifferent to the traditions that had once bound the organization together. Some accounts of the period suggest Castellano also avoided visiting Della Croce during his final weeks of illness, a decision that, if accurate, only deepened the sense among Della Croce's loyalists that their own underboss had been treated as an afterthought by the man he had spent 9 years quietly propping up. The second decision compounded the damage from the first. With the underboss position now vacant, Castellano needed to name a replacement. and the choice he made stunned much of the organization. Rather than elevating one of the senior capos who had spent decades building relationships and earning respect inside the family, Castellano promoted Thomas Bilotti, his own personal driver and bodyguard, into the second highest position in the entire organization. Bilotti had come up through a Staten Island crew associated with Capo John D'Alessio and his brothers, working for years as a chauffeur and bodyguard for D'Alessio's uncle, a capo named Alexander Debrizzi, who controlled Gambino interests along the Staten Island waterfront, before eventually attaching himself closely to Castellano personally. Bilotti's own path to the top of the organization had almost nothing in common with the traditional route most capos followed, built instead entirely on personal proximity and service to one man, rather than years spent running a crew, settling disputes, or building the kind of independent reputation that senior Gambino figures expected from anyone occupying the second highest position in the family. He was known among the men who dealt with him as short-tempered and foul-mouthed, a man whose recorded conversations from the mansion tapes were reportedly filled almost constantly with profanity. One of the FBI agents who monitored those recordings later described Bilotti's temper as something closer to a nuclear reactor overheating than an ordinary outburst, building slowly until it reached a threshold and then consuming everything around it, his voice rising and his language collapsing into little more than strung-together curses once he lost control. Whatever loyalty and work ethic Bilotti had shown Castellano over the years, he had no independent standing inside the broader organization. No network of relationships built through years running his own crew, and no claim to the position beyond his personal closeness to the boss who appointed him. Senior capos who had spent their entire careers working their way up through the traditional structure of the family, men who felt they had far stronger claims to the underboss position than a former driver, took the appointment as a second deliberate insult layered directly on top of the first. These two decisions, made within days of each other in the immediate aftermath of Della Croce's death, gave Gotti and a small group of other dissatisfied Gambino figures both the motive and the opening they needed to move against Castellano directly. The men who eventually organized the conspiracy against him became known among investigators and later in court testimony as a group sometimes referred to as the Fist, made up of Gotti himself, Capo Joseph Joe Piney Armone, Soldier Frank DeCicco, Capo Robert DiBernardo, and Salvatore Gravano. This was not simply a coalition of Della Croce loyalists acting out of grief and anger over the wake. DeCicco in particular had been considered a Castellano loyalist for years, someone who had personally carried out earlier orders on Castellano's behalf, including his role in arranging the killing of Nicholas Schibetta back in 1978. His willingness to join a conspiracy against the same man he had once served loyally showed how far Castellano's standing had fallen across multiple factions of the family, not just among the traditional Della Croce loyalists, who had never fully accepted his leadership in the first place. Gravano's own path into the conspiracy reflected a similarly pragmatic rather than purely emotional calculation. According to his later testimony, Gravano concluded that Castellano's removal had become both unavoidable and manageable once he saw how many senior figures across both factions of the family were quietly willing to support it. And he judged that backing the plan offered the most realistic way to protect his own crew and his own position once the change in leadership eventually happened. Gravano reportedly floated an early idea for how the hit might be carried out, suggesting Castellano and Bilotti could be killed together while eating breakfast at a diner the two men were known to visit. A plan set aside once a better opportunity presented itself through an entirely different channel. What emerged, in the account later reconstructed through court testimony, was less a single tightly organized plot than what one writer studying the case described as a transient coalition of factions, each concluding on its own that it had more to lose by staying passive than by joining the move against Castellano. Beyond the insult of the wake and the Bilotti promotion, one additional piece of information pushed the conspiracy from resentment into active planning. Gotti learned that Castellano intended to break up his crew entirely, a move tied directly back to the unresolved standoff over the Ruggiero wiretap transcripts and the drug trafficking charges hanging over Gotti's brother Gene and his close friend Angelo Ruggiero. Facing the possibility that Castellano might dismantle the entire crew he had spent years building and protecting, Gotti concluded that striking first, before Castellano could act against him, was the only way to protect his own position and his men. What the conspirators needed next was an opportunity. A moment where Castellano could be reliably found in a location where a hit team could reach him without excessive risk. That opportunity came through an unlikely channel. In the weeks following Della Croce's death, several senior Gambino figures, including DeCicco himself along with Capo James Failla, approached Castellano and urged him to meet personally with Della Croce's son, a gesture meant to smooth over the growing tension inside the family and repair some of the damage caused by Castellano's absence from the wake. Castellano agreed to the meeting, seeing it as a reasonable step toward calming a situation he understood, at least on some level, had become dangerous. The meeting itself, along with several other pieces of Gambino family business, was folded into a larger dinner gathering scheduled for the evening of December 16, 1985, at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan, a location Castellano had used before without incident. DeCicco, sitting inside the conspiracy while maintaining his public appearance as a Castellano loyalist arranging a peacemaking gesture, passed word of the scheduled meeting directly to Gotti. For men who had spent weeks searching for a reliable opportunity to reach Castellano outside the heavily guarded walls of his Staten Island mansion, a confirmed dinner meeting at a public restaurant in Manhattan, arranged through Castellano's own trusted circle and appearing on the surface as an ordinary piece of family business, offered exactly the kind of predictable, low-risk setting the conspiracy had been waiting for. The arrangement carried a particular irony that would only become clear afterward. The same gesture designed to repair Castellano's damaged standing with Della Croce's grieving loyalists. A meeting meant as a peace offering became instead the exact mechanism that delivered him into the hands of the men who had already decided his leadership could not continue. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Within roughly 2 weeks of burying his own underboss, Castellano had alienated senior capos through a missed wake, angered the broader organization through an unpopular promotion, and unknowingly walked directly into a trap built by men inside his own inner circle, some of whom had spent years working loyally on his behalf before deciding his leadership had become a problem that needed to be permanently removed. Section 8. The Ambush Outside Sparks Steakhouse. On Monday, December 16, 1985, Thomas Bellotti drove Paul Castellano into Manhattan for what both men understood to be an ordinary evening of family business. The plan called for a stop at Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street, a well-known restaurant between 2nd and 3rd Avenues that Castellano had used before without any trouble. The dinner was meant to bring together several senior Gambino figures, including a meeting with Aniello Della Croce's son, arranged in the weeks after Della Croce's death as a gesture toward smoothing over tensions that had been building inside the family. Castellano had no reason to expect anything unusual. He had spent years running the organization from behind the walls of his Staten Island mansion, and an evening meeting with his own men at a familiar Manhattan restaurant fit the ordinary rhythm of how he conducted business when he did leave home. Sparks Steakhouse itself was an established, well-regarded restaurant in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of place organized crime figures had used for years to conduct meetings that needed to look, to any outside observer, like nothing more than a group of businessmen having dinner. It sat on a busy stretch of East 46th Street, close enough to the intersection with 3rd Avenue that foot traffic moved past its entrance constantly during the evening rush hour. A detail that cut 2 ways for anyone planning violence there. A crowded sidewalk offered gunmen the cover of a busy scene to disappear into once the shooting stopped. But it also meant that whatever happened outside the restaurant's doors would happen in front of dozens of ordinary New Yorkers heading home from work in the days leading up to Christmas. Waiting for him were men who had spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment. According to testimony Salvatore Gravano later gave in court, the operation involved roughly 11 men in total. A mix of shooters, backup men, and drivers assigned to handle the getaway once the hit was finished. Nearly all of them belonged to the Gambino family themselves, and most held the rank of made men. A detail that underscored just how deeply the conspiracy against Castellano had spread through his own organization, rather than remaining confined to a handful of disgruntled outsiders. A hit team made up of Salvatore Scala, John Carneglia, Vincent Artuso, and Edward Lino positioned themselves near the restaurant's main entrance, dressed in trench coats and fur hats, meant to obscure their faces and blend into the winter evening crowd moving along a busy Manhattan street just over a week before Christmas. Gravano later recalled, in comments made decades afterward, that the specific choice of matching beige coats and Russian-style fur hats may have originated with Angelo Ruggiero, though Gravano himself was not entirely certain of the detail even years later. A small but telling reminder of how much of the planning behind the hit was pieced together secondhand and remembered imperfectly, even by the men who had been there. A second group of men stood farther down the block as backup, ready to step in if anything went wrong with the primary team's approach, including Angelo Ruggiero, Joseph Watts, and several other Gambino associates. John Gotti and Salvatore Gravano parked a separate car nearby, close enough to watch the entire operation unfold from a short distance, but far enough removed that neither man would need to fire a shot themselves. The arrangement placed the two men most responsible for organizing the conspiracy in a position to observe everything without exposing either of them to the direct legal risk that came with pulling a trigger. A decision that would matter enormously years later, when prosecutors tried to connect Gotti personally to a killing he had never physically participated in. At approximately 5:25 in the evening, Gravano used a walkie-talkie to alert the men positioned outside the restaurant that Castellano's black Lincoln Continental was approaching the block. Bellotti drove the car to a stop roughly 100 feet east of the intersection near the restaurant entrance. Castellano and Bellotti had briefly stopped at a red light directly beside the car where Gotti and Gravano were sitting, close enough that the two vehicles were side by side for a moment, though the tinted windows on Gotti's car kept Castellano and Bellotti from seeing who was sitting inside. For a few seconds, the two men who had ordered Castellano's death and the two men about to die sat only feet apart in traffic, separated by nothing more than a pane of tinted glass and a red light that would soon turn green. As Castellano stepped out of the passenger side of the Lincoln at around 5:26 p.m., the men waiting near the entrance moved quickly toward him. He was shot multiple times before he had a chance to react, collapsing beside a lamppost just outside the restaurant, only a few feet from the open passenger door of the car that had carried him there. According to testimony Gravano later gave in court, John Carneglia was the gunman responsible for the shot that struck Castellano in the head. Bellotti, who had stepped out of the driver's side at nearly the same moment, tried briefly to react to what was happening, but Gambino associate John Carneglia's crew member had already moved into position behind him. Bellotti was shot as he stood in the street, struck multiple times, and collapsed roughly 2 yards from the sidewalk, close to but separate from where Castellano had fallen. Within a matter of seconds, the two most powerful men in the Gambino crime family, the boss and his newly appointed underboss, were both dead on a public Manhattan sidewalk during the evening rush hour, in full view of dozens of pedestrians and passing cars. The entire shooting lasted only a few seconds. As soon as it was over, the gunmen who had carried it out dispersed quickly into the surrounding streets, blending back into the crowd the same way they had used the trench coats and fur hats to blend in only moments earlier. Gotti and Gravano, who had watched the entire operation unfold from their parked car, did not immediately drive away. Instead, according to Gravano's later testimony, the two men drove slowly past the scene to confirm that both Castellano and Bellotti were dead before finally leaving the area, continuing south toward Brooklyn once they had seen enough to know the operation had succeeded. Gravano would later describe looking down at Bellatti's body as they passed and telling Gotti simply that he was gone. Police arrived at the scene within minutes to find both bodies still lying where they had fallen, blood visible on the pavement beneath the winter coats both men had been wearing only moments earlier. News of the killings spread through law enforcement and organized crime circles almost immediately. An FBI spokesman, when later asked about the funeral arrangements that followed, admitted that even federal agents monitoring the situation closely did not have advance knowledge of exactly when or where Castellano would be buried. A sign of just how quickly and quietly his own associates worked to manage the aftermath. Newspapers across the country carried the story the following day, describing a double homicide that had unfolded in the middle of one of Manhattan's busiest commercial districts during the height of the holiday shopping season. Only blocks from department stores and office buildings still filling with evening commuters when the shots were fired. The killing set off immediate concern among law enforcement officials that New York was about to enter a period of serious instability inside its organized crime structure. Removing the boss of the largest and most powerful of the five families through an unsanctioned, unauthorized hit, rather than through the kind of commission-approved process that traditionally governed changes in leadership at that level, broke one of the underworld's oldest rules. Investigators worried openly in the days after the shooting that the killing might trigger a broader war for control of the Gambino organization, given how directly it violated the normal channels through which power was supposed to change hands among the five families. Some coverage at the time noted that no gangland killing in New York had drawn this level of public attention since Albert Anastasia's own murder in a hotel barbershop in 1957. A comparison that underscored just how significant Castellano's death was within the specific, insular world of organized crime leadership, even as the wider public largely knew him, if at all, only as a distant, rarely photographed figure compared to the more publicly visible boss who would soon take his place. Castellano's funeral arrangements reflected just how far his standing had fallen, even in death. The Roman Catholic Archdiocese of New York, under Cardinal John O'Connor, refused to allow a public funeral mass for Castellano, citing the notorious nature of his life and the manner of his death. A spokesman for the Archdiocese later stated that the decision to bury Castellano in a non-sectarian cemetery rather than through a full Catholic funeral was technically made by the family rather than being a direct order from the cardinal, though the effect was largely the same either way. Castellano had been a registered parishioner of a Staten Island Catholic church for years, and the denial of a public mass marked one of the relatively rare occasions where the church took that kind of visible stance against a figure tied to organized crime, a decision that generated its own separate wave of newspaper coverage and public debate in the days that followed. Castellano's body was quietly moved from the Cusimano and Russo funeral home in Brooklyn on a Thursday morning, only 3 days after the shooting, and buried at the non-sectarian Moravian Cemetery in the New Dorp section of Staten Island. The funeral home had reportedly told reporters the burial would take place on Friday, a piece of misdirection apparently intended to keep the actual event away from press coverage. A priest was present at the graveside, and Cardinal O'Connor did permit a private memorial mass for the family, held without Castellano's body present. But the public ceremony expected for a man who had once been called the boss of bosses never took place. Bellotti was buried in the same cemetery, in a much simpler grave, roughly 50 yards from Castellano's own crypt. A final resting place that placed the driver who had died beside his boss only a short distance away from him, even in death, though separated by the same gap in status that had defined their entire relationship. Within roughly 2 weeks of the killing, John Gotti was formally recognized as the new boss of the Gambino crime family, completing the transfer of power the conspiracy had been built around from the start. The killing had been carried out entirely without the commission's approval, an omission that did not go unnoticed by leaders of New York's other crime families. Vincent Gigante, boss of the Genovese family, was reportedly outraged that Gotti had removed a sitting boss without following the traditional process requiring commission authorization for a hit of that magnitude. And he enlisted help from Lucchese family boss Anthony Corallo in organizing retaliation. On April 13, 1986, a car bomb intended for Gotti exploded outside a social club in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. Gotti himself was not present when the device detonated. Instead, the bomb killed Frank DeCicco, the same man who had helped tip Gotti off about the December 16th meeting at Sparks, and who had gone on to serve as Gotti's own underboss after Castellano's death, struck down by a bomb apparently meant for the very man he had helped put in power. Gotti's own rise to public prominence following Castellano's death took on a character almost entirely opposite to his predecessor's reclusive style. Where Castellano had spent his final years rarely leaving his mansion, Gotti became a highly visible public figure, known for expensive tailored suits and a level of media attention no Gambino boss before him had ever courted. He earned the nickname the Teflon Don after surviving 3 separate criminal trials in the 1980s without a conviction, a run of acquittals that only ended once Gravano's cooperation gave prosecutors the direct, insider testimony they had lacked in the earlier cases. That eventual conviction, delivered in April 1992 and finalized with a life sentence 2 months later, brought Gotti's own career to the same kind of conclusion Castellano himself had likely been facing before his death. A lengthy federal prison sentence, built substantially on the testimony of a man who had once stood at his side. For nearly 7 years after the killing, no one was formally charged with Castellano's murder. That changed after Salvatore Gravano, facing his own mounting legal troubles, made the decision to become a government witness. His cooperation gave federal prosecutors detailed, first-hand testimony about the planning and execution of the hit, delivered directly by one of the men who had watched it happen from a parked car only yards away. On April 2, 1992, based substantially on Gravano's testimony, John Gotti was convicted of numerous racketeering charges, including his role in ordering Castellano's murder. On June 23, 1992, Gotti was sentenced to life in federal prison. He died there in 2002 from complications related to throat cancer. No one else was ever formally charged in connection with Castellano's murder, and Gravano himself received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation, eventually serving only about 5 years, despite admitting to involvement in 19 killings over the course of his criminal career. A resolution that left the men who had actually fired the shots outside Sparks Steakhouse never formally held accountable in a courtroom for what happened that December evening. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The killing outside Sparks Steakhouse brought an end to nearly 3 decades during which Paul Castellano had moved from a Brooklyn butcher's son with a minor robbery conviction to the head of the most powerful crime family in the United States. And it closed out a life defined by the same contradiction that had shaped nearly every major decision he made along the way. A man who spent his final years trying to run an organized crime family like a corporation, only to be removed from power the same way organized crime had always settled its disputes long before Castellano ever tried to change it. Section 9. The Commission falls, and what was left behind. Castellano's death on December 16, 1985, did not end the legal cases hanging over him. It simply removed him as a defendant from 2 of the largest organized crime prosecutions in American history, cases that continued moving through federal court against the men who had once stood beside him. The larger of the 2 was the Mafia Commission trial, formerly titled United States versus Anthony Salerno et al. On February 25, 1985, 9 of New York's most powerful organized crime figures were indicted together, accused under the federal RICO law of running the Commission, the ruling body that had settled disputes and approved major decisions across the 5 families since the early 1930s. The original 9 defendants included Castellano as boss of the Gambino family, Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno as boss of the Genovese family, Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo as boss of the Lucchese family, Philip Rusty Rastelli as boss of the Bonanno family, and Aniello della Croce, alongside several other senior figures tied to labor racketeering and the same concrete club arrangement Castellano had spent decades building. Investigators had spent 5 years assembling the case, using more than 170 court-approved wiretaps and over 200 federal agents to gather evidence linking each defendant to specific racketeering acts carried out in service of the Commission's goals, including its role approving the 1979 murder of Bonanno boss Carmine Galante and the 1981 killing of Bonanno capo Alphonse Indelicato. By the end of 1985, 2 of the original 9 men named in that indictment were dead. Della Croce died from cancer on December 2nd. Castellano was shot to death 2 weeks later. Rastelli was separated from the case to face a different set of charges related to labor racketeering, and prosecutors added Colombo family boss Carmine Persico in his place. Persico chose to represent himself at trial, believing his own presence in front of the jury gave him a better chance of winning over at least one juror than a hired defense attorney could manage. Genovese boss Vincent Chin Gigante avoided indictment entirely during this period, having spent years feigning mental illness, regularly seen wandering New York sidewalks in pajamas and mumbling incoherently as a strategy to avoid prosecution. While the commission case was still being prepared, Castellano found himself facing an entirely separate federal trial that had already begun before his death. In October 1985, he and several other defendants went to trial on charges tied to a large-scale car theft ring that had shipped stolen vehicles overseas and was connected to 25 murders, an operation built around the same Roy DeMeo crew responsible for killing Nicholas Sciabetta, Frank Amato, and eventually DeMeo himself. Castellano was not accused of personally committing any of the violence connected to that ring. Testimony from a cooperating witness named Dominic Montiglio, whose uncle Nino Gaggi was Castellano's own co-defendant in the case, suggested Castellano had actually expressed discomfort after learning that DeMeo's crew had killed the young girlfriend of a suspected informant along with the informant himself. A detail that fit the broader pattern of a man who preferred his violence controlled, deliberate, and limited to what he judged necessary rather than excessive. Some law enforcement officials who worked the case later believed Castellano stood a reasonable chance of winning that particular trial. A former Gambino capo named Michael DiLeonardo, reflecting on the situation years afterward, disagreed with that assessment, arguing that even if Castellano had avoided conviction in the car theft case, the commission trial still waiting behind it made a lengthy prison sentence essentially unavoidable no matter what happened with the earlier charges. That assessment turned out to match almost exactly what happened to the men who remained standing trial after Castellano's death. The commission case ran for 10 weeks before reaching the jury, built on 85 witnesses and roughly 150 tape recordings gathered over years of surveillance. On November 19, 1986, after 6 days of deliberation, the jury convicted 8 of the remaining defendants on every count they faced, including all 3 of the mob bosses still standing trial: Salerno, Persico, and Corallo. Only Alphonse Indelicato's co-defendant, Anthony Bruno Indelicato, received a different verdict, convicted specifically of Carmine Galante's murder rather than the broader racketeering conspiracy charge. On January 13, 1987, Judge Richard Owen handed down sentences that made clear how completely the case had succeeded. Salerno, Persico, Corallo, Underboss Gennaro Langella, Underboss Salvatore Santoro, and Consigliere Christopher Fernari were each sentenced to 100 years in federal prison, the maximum penalty available under the RICO statute, along with substantial fines. Ralph Scopo, a Colombo soldier who had also served as president of the Concrete Workers Union at the center of the Concrete Club scheme, received the same 100-year sentence. Indelicato was sentenced to 40 years for the Galante murder. 6 of the convicted men eventually died in federal prison, including all 3 bosses: Salerno, Corallo, and Persico. Indelicato and Fernari were the only two defendants who eventually won parole, released in 1998 and 2014 respectively, after serving well over a decade each. Given that Castellano had faced the exact same racketeering charges, built from the exact same evidence about the Commission's role in construction industry extortion and sanctioned killings, the outcome of the trial against his co-defendants left little doubt about what almost certainly would have happened to him had he lived long enough to sit through the same verdict. A 100-year sentence, effectively a life term with no realistic path to release, was the fate waiting for the boss of bosses, whether John Gotti's hit team reached him first or not. In an odd, specific sense, the men who killed Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse did not prevent him from facing the same consequences closing in on every other Commission-era boss of his generation. They simply arrived a few months before the federal government would have delivered the same result through a courtroom instead of a sidewalk. Gotti's takeover of the Gambino family in the immediate aftermath of the killing has already been covered in the events at Sparks Steakhouse, and the 7-year gap before Gravano's testimony finally produced a conviction for the murder itself. What happened to the people closest to Castellano personally, rather than the organization he had run, followed a much quieter and less publicly documented path. Gloria Olarte, the Colombian housekeeper whose affair with Castellano had driven his wife out of the Tot Hill mansion 2 years before his death, left New York within days of the killing. She traveled back to Colombia carrying $18,000 in cash and a porcelain clown Castellano had given her as a gift during their years together, the only physical remnants she kept from a relationship that had reshaped both her own life and the internal politics of one of the largest crime families in the country. She avoided public attention for decades afterward, declining to discuss her time inside the Castellano household with reporters or investigators until she appeared, briefly and on her own terms, in a 2020 Netflix documentary examining organized crime's history in New York, offering a rare first-hand account of a period she had otherwise kept private for more than 30 years. The Tot Hill mansion itself outlived the man who built it by decades, changing hands several times in the years after his death. Reports on the sale price Castellano's family received when the property first left their ownership vary somewhat depending on the source, with figures cited anywhere from $3.5 million to $5 million, reflecting the difficulty of getting precise, agreed-upon numbers on a private real estate transaction tied to a notorious former owner. What is better documented is what happened afterward. In 2000, the property sold again for $3.1 million to Sal Rusi, the head of a real estate company called Salmar Properties, who has owned it since. Decades later, long after the Gambino family's power had faded from what it once was under Castellano and then Gotti, the same mansion built to resemble the White House and nicknamed exactly that by both mobsters and federal agents was listed for sale again, at prices ranging between roughly $16 and $18 million, depending on the specific listing year. Still standing on its hilltop above Staten Island, still drawing curiosity from people aware of exactly whose business had once been conducted inside its dining room. Taken together, the years following Castellano's death told a story with very little ambiguity left in it. The organization he had spent nearly a decade trying to remake in his own image, built around legitimate-looking businesses, careful financial arrangements, and a boss who preferred negotiation to violence whenever negotiation was available, did not survive his removal intact. Gotti's own tenure as boss ended in a federal prison cell built on the same kind of surveillance and cooperating witness testimony that had already destroyed Castellano's own leadership years earlier. The commission itself, the governing structure Castellano had once sat near the top of, was effectively dismantled by the same 1986 trial that would almost certainly have ended his own freedom had he lived to see its verdict. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What set Castellano apart from the other bosses convicted alongside his co-defendants was not the severity of what he had done, judged purely on results, on murders ordered and rackets run. His record matched or exceeded most of the men who did stand trial and did receive 100-year sentences. What set him apart was the particular shape his downfall took. Removed not by a jury after a lengthy federal trial, but by men who had once called him boss. In a killing planned inside his own organization, arranged in part by a soldier he had once trusted enough to hand a murder contract. Over a promotion, a missed wake, and a set of transcripts he never got to read. Section 10. Worse than Goodfellas. Separating the real story from the movie. Because Paul Castellano and the fictional Paulie Cicero share a first name, and because both are described as calm, business-minded crime bosses who preferred negotiation over violence, it is easy to assume Goodfellas is somehow based on Castellano's own life. It is not. Martin Scorsese's 1990 film is drawn from Nicholas Pileggi's 1985 book, Wise Guy, which tells the true story of Henry Hill, an associate of the Lucchese crime family, not the Gambino family. Castellano spent nearly a decade running. The character audiences know as Paulie Cicero, played by Paul Sorvino, is based on a real Lucchese capo named Paul Vario, a completely different man from a completely different organization, whose life followed its own separate and largely unconnected path through New York's criminal underworld. Paul Vario was born on July 10, 1914, and rose through the Lucchese family's ranks in Brooklyn, eventually becoming a capo who oversaw illegal gambling, loan sharking, and the fencing of stolen goods out of a modest set of businesses, including a flower shop and a cab stand he used as an informal office. Federal prosecutors at the time described him as one of the most violent and dangerous career criminals operating in New York City, a reputation that stood in sharp contrast to how the film portrays him. In Goodfellas, Paulie Cicero comes across as quiet, controlled, and almost fatherly toward the younger men in his crew. The real Paul Vario had a hair-trigger temper. In one well-documented incident recounted in Wise Guy, a maitre d' at a restaurant accidentally spilled wine on Vario's wife's dress, and Vario responded by sending 2 carloads of armed men to beat the restaurant staff after closing. He eventually went to prison on charges tied to Henry Hill's own cooperation with federal investigators, and died there in 1988 from lung failure connected to lung cancer at the Fort Worth Federal Correctional Institution in Texas. Henry Hill himself, the film's narrator and central figure, began working for Vario's crew as a teenager and went on to help plan the 1978 Lufthansa heist at John F. Kennedy Airport, one of the largest cash robberies ever committed on American soil at the time. Hill was eventually arrested on drug trafficking charges in 1980 and, facing the possibility that his own associates might have him killed to protect themselves, agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors. His testimony helped convict Vario and several others, and Hill spent the rest of his life largely outside the organized crime world he had once idolized as a boy, eventually dying of complications related to heart disease in 2012. None of this history intersects with Paul Castellano or the Gambino family in any direct way. The two organizations operated in the same city during overlapping years, but Hill, Vario, and the rest of the film's central cast belong to an entirely separate crime family with its own leadership, its own internal disputes, and its own eventual downfall. There is, however, one genuine point where the true story behind Goodfellas crosses directly into the Gambino family that Castellano actually ran, and it involves one of the film's most memorable scenes. The character known in the movie as Billy Batts, the loudmouth made man beaten to death after taunting Tommy DeVito about an old shoeshine job, is based on a real Gambino crime family member named William Bentvina. Bentvina had become a full-made member of the Gambino family in 1961, and after serving several years in prison on drug trafficking charges, was released in 1970 and welcomed back with a party at a Queens bar. According to Henry Hill's own account, Bentvina made an offhand comment during that party, asking Tommy DeSimone, the real man behind the fictional Tommy DeVito, whether he still shined shoes. a reference to work DeSimone had done as a younger man. DeSimone, known even among violent men for an unusually short and dangerous temper, treated the comment as a serious insult. Weeks later, on June 10, 1970, DeSimone attacked Bentvina at a club, and together with Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill, beat and eventually killed him, disposing of the body afterward. The killing violated one of the Mafia's most rigid rules. Bentvina was a formally made member of the Gambino family, and under the Commission's own governing structure, killing a made man without securing permission from his family first was treated as an automatic, unappealable death sentence for whoever carried it out. DeSimone was not a made member of any family himself at the time, only an associate working under Vario in the Lucchese organization, which meant he had killed a Gambino soldier entirely outside the chain of authorization the Commission required for something that serious. Making matters more dangerous for DeSimone, he was also responsible for a second unauthorized killing a few years later. On December 18, 1974, DeSimone killed Ronald Foxy Giroth, a Gambino associate who happened to be a close friend of a rising Gambino capo named John Gotti, the same man who would later organize the killing of Castellano himself 11 years afterward. For nearly a decade, DeSimone faced no consequences for either killing, a delay that some accounts attribute to a kind of quiet mutual understanding between the Lucchese and Gambino families that allowed profitable rackets tied to Bentvina's old territory to keep running undisturbed. That changed in January 1979, 3 years into Castellano's tenure as boss of the Gambino family. According to Henry Hill, DeSimone was told he was finally going to be formally inducted as a made man, a ceremony he prepared for by dressing in his finest clothing and saying goodbye to his mother before being driven away by fellow Lucchese associates. Instead of an induction ceremony, DeSimone was killed. His body has never been found, and he was legally declared dead more than a decade later in 1990. Exactly who carried out DeSimone's killing, and exactly why the order was finally given after 9 years of inaction, remains genuinely disputed even among the people closest to the events. Hill maintained that the Gambino family was behind the killing, motivated by the unauthorized deaths of both Bentvina and Giroth, and some accounts specifically place John Gotti at the center of authorizing or even personally carrying out the hit, as revenge for his friend Giroth. A separate account, sourced to a mob associate named Joseph Iannuzzi, credits a different Gambino-connected figure, Thomas Agro, with carrying out the killing, and claims DeSimone's death was slow and deliberately painful, rather than the quick execution shown on screen. What most versions of the story agree on is the underlying mechanism that finally sealed DeSimone's fate. Paul Vario himself, the real man behind Paulie Cicero, is widely believed to have been the one who finally disclosed DeSimone's role in Bentvina's killing to the Gambino organization, motivated at least in part by a personal grudge after DeSimone assaulted Karen Hill, Henry Hill's wife, while Vario himself was secretly having an affair with her. Whatever the exact mechanics behind it, the killing represented a real, documented act of Gambino family justice, carried out during the years Paul Castellano sat at the top of that same organization, enforcing the same unwritten rules about unauthorized violence that Castellano had spent his own career trying to run through more businesslike, controlled channels. It stands as the one factual thread connecting the fictionalized world of Goodfellas directly back to the actual family Castellano led, even though none of the film's central characters ever worked for him, and his own name never appears anywhere in Pileggi's book or Scorsese's film. Set side by side, the two stories reveal very different kinds of truth. Goodfellas tells the story of an associate, Henry Hill, who worked underneath a Lucchese capo for years, participated in one of the largest cash robberies in American history, and ultimately survived by betraying the men who trusted him, trading their freedom for his own safety inside a witness protection program he could never quite settle into. It is a story about ambition, greed, and the slow unraveling of loyalty among men who once called themselves friends. Castellano's own story, when checked against court records, FBI surveillance, and the sworn testimony of the men who eventually turned on him, follows a very different shape. He did not claw his way up from nothing through hijackings and heists the way Hill did. He married into power, inherited a business empire built on construction rackets and union control, and spent decades trying to convert an organization built on violence into something that functioned more like a legitimate corporation, complete with financial tracking, negotiated arrangements, and a boss who preferred staying home in a 17-room mansion to walking the same streets his soldiers worked. What makes Castellano's own documented history remarkable is not that it resembles Goodfellas. It is that so little of it needs any embellishment at all to feel as dramatic as anything Scorsese ever put on screen. A man ordered the killing of a young man dating his daughter over a comment comparing his face to a chicken salesman. And that killing sat as an open rumor for nearly 30 years, until a rival family's own boss confirmed it in court documents. A man ordered the death of his own son-in-law for beating his daughter, using the same crew that had already carried out dozens of other killings on his behalf, and was never convicted for it because the case against him ended with his own murder before a jury could decide. A man built a mansion modeled on the White House, moved his mistress into it while his wife of more than 4 decades still lived under the same roof, and had the entire arrangement recorded by federal agents who hid microphones inside his own kitchen and dining room while he vacationed in Florida, unaware his own voice was being captured for what would become over 600 hours of evidence. And in the end, the same organization that promoted him past its most experienced, most respected underboss on his cousin's dying word, watched him skip that underboss's funeral, replace him with a driver who had no standing among the men expected to follow him, and then, within 2 weeks, planned and carried out his execution on a public Manhattan sidewalk, using men who had once called him boss, arranged through an invitation his own trusted soldier had personally delivered. None of that required a screenwriter. Every piece of it sits in court records, FBI transcripts, contemporaneous newspaper coverage, and the sworn testimony of the men who lived through it, several of whom went on to describe the events in precise, first-person detail once their own legal troubles gave them reason to cooperate, with the same federal government that had spent years trying to bring Castellano down. Paul Vario, the real inspiration for the film's most recognizable boss, died quietly in a federal prison hospital bed from a disease that had been slowly killing him for years. Paul Castellano died standing on a Manhattan sidewalk in front of a steakhouse, shot by men from his own family, 3 weeks before Christmas, in front of dozens of witnesses who had no idea what they were watching until the shooting had already stopped. Both men carried the same first name into very different endings, running 2 different criminal organizations that occasionally crossed paths without ever fully overlapping. And only one of them left behind a true story that a Hollywood film ever needed to soften. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.